Okay, we're going to give everyone just a couple seconds just to get in from the waiting room, and then we'll start in just about 1 minute. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Trish Tarrant, and I am the Assistant Dean for Graduate Programs here in Salinger. Tonight is our fourth and final event in the Salinger Connect webinar series for this academic year, and we're going to be diving into the topic about convergence of data and economics, emphasizing how economic theory can really enhance the quality of your analysis. Many of you have sent in questions when you registered for this webinar, and those were very helpful in framing the webinar. We appreciate that. If you do have additional questions during the webinar, please put those in the chat, and I will be monitoring that, and we can get those over to our panelists. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to our moderator, Dr. Andrew Samuel, who is a professor in the Salinger School of Business. Dr. Samuel has done a lot of research in this, has great experience in this area. I know you'll find the next hour to be extremely informative. Andrew?
Thanks, Trish. Thank you all for coming here on this beautiful day. If you're in Baltimore, you know that it's a nice sunny day. And so the opportunity cost of sitting and listening to a seminar on data and economics is quite high. So we appreciate your presence here. I'm going to begin by briefly introducing our panelists. I won't tell you a lot about what they do as data scientists or economists. I'll leave it up to them to speak on their experience in their own words. Once I have introduced them, I will then offer a few introductory comments to set the stage for this conversation on the intersection of data and economics, and then turn it over to the panelists by asking them some questions. So that's briefly the outline of the rest of today's panel. Okay, so today we have Anthony, who is at JP Morgan in corporate transformation. He was a former student of mine, and I'm very glad to see him here again. Daniel, who is, I just found out, an MBA student at Darden, but was previously with Health Economics and Outcomes Research. Tom Hart is unfortunately not going to be able to be with us tonight. He had a very last-minute personal emergency that he needed to attend to. We've got Brian Nelson, who is Senior Director of Corporate Strategy at Teradata. And finally, Norm Sedgley, who many of you, if you're students at Loyola, will know. Norm, besides being a faculty member in the economics department, also has a very flourishing consulting practice in data science and economics, and will be drawing on his experiences both as a professor as well as in his consulting practice in this panel. Okay, so before we field questions, as I said, I want to set the stage for this conversation by talking about where economics and data science meet. And I'll do so by pointing to the contributions of three industry leaders who are all economics professors or economists. The people I want to talk about first is Hal Varian. Hal Varian won the Nobel Prize in economics about 15 years ago. He was one of the chief economists at Google in its founding years, and he played a really key role in developing analytics to optimize Google's auctions for online advertisements. Another person I want to highlight is Susan Athey. She's a very active researcher right now. She works closely with Microsoft primarily on the development of Bing, as well as Microsoft's Copilot, which some of you might be familiar with. And then finally, Patrick Bajari, who used to be, I guess, Amazon's chief analytics officer, and he is now at this AI firm, Keystone AI. And much of what I'm going to be talking about really draws on the ideas of these three economists who have taken their expertise as economists and gone into the industry, especially into this field of data science. And I want to sort of pose this question: what do they, as economists, bring to the table at these firms like Google and Microsoft, which are full of data scientists and data engineers and people with heavy-duty machine learning backgrounds and things like that? And what I'd like to point out is two key ideas, two key issues that I think economists really can contribute to this question of how do we use data in the world of business and policy. So what is the contribution of economists? The first contribution that economists really bring to the table is that we understand what is called the data generating process. That is, how did the data come into existence? And the second issue I think that economists can really contribute to is that we as economists have spent decades developing techniques to understand what correlations speak to causal relationships and which ones do not. And again, these are actually from interviews with those three economists. This was from an article in Harvard Business Review a few years ago. And I'm going to expand on each of these two ideas. What is, or what do we mean by this idea of a data generating process? And this question of sort of how can we speak to causal relationships? So how does a data set come into existence? I'm going to give you an example from my own personal consulting experience that's actually going on right now. I'm being asked to try to understand the effectiveness of school bus safety inspections. Oops. Now, it turns out many private school buses in a state that I'm not going to mention are very good at hiding malfunctioning buses when an inspection is impending. So literally, they hide the buses in a different parking lot when the inspector's going to come and inspect buses for safety. So which means that if you look at inspection data, you only observe the ones that the buses that have been caught, the ones have been found by the inspector. So there's an inherent selection bias in the data generating process. The way the data of inspections has been created ignores all the buses that were hidden by the school bus company. Now, economists have a solution for a problem like this. We can use a theoretical model of inspections to identify which buses will be hidden, and then use that to at least to some degree overcome the selection bias. And that's, in some sense, what I'm being asked to do along with some data scientists in this project. So understanding how the data comes into existence can be a very critical question when you're only seeing some of the data. The second issue is a little bit more complicated: prediction versus intervention. Do you need to predict or decide on some kind of an intervention? This could be a policy intervention or could be something like changing prices in the context of a firm. So consider a fictitious beach town, Market Wave Bay, where the waves are always analyzed for their potential market impact. Okay, so you've got an economist trying to monitor firms for, monitor the waves. Okay, so the local business association wants to predict hotel prices. Whenever the waves are good, hotel prices are high because there's a lot of people showing up. And when the waves are mushy, the demand is low. Okay, so if you're trying to predict prices, all you care about are these points A, B, and C where demand and supply intersect, right? You want to just look at good weather days. You know, lots of people will show up to the beach. That's going to help you predict what the prices are going to be. You don't need much else. The problem is this won't tell you whether or if you change prices, demand will rise or fall, or if you change some other lever, whether demand will change. For that, you need some way to capture or estimate the supply and demand curve. Suppose, for example, the local business authority wants to give tourists discounts to lower the price of a hotel room. Now, you've got, if you remember your economics, you've got to estimate the demand elasticity. How much will demand rise if prices are reduced by some percentage? You need to know the slope of the demand. Now, it turns out economists actually have a way of doing this using what is called a structural econometric model, if you've taken econometrics. It has to account for both supply and demand. We could do that, for example, by saying, okay, perhaps there are some times of the year when there are fewer hotels that are open. This is this dashed line, seasonally open hotels, and other times all hotels are open. Now you can observe using those data points X and Y, which can start to give you a way of tracing out this demand curve. And once you have that demand curve, you can start to go back and think of how much will demand change if you lower prices along this demand curve. So to summarize, the reason people like Hal Varian and Susan Athey and others have been brought on to firms like Google and Microsoft is because of this kind of stuff. The ability not just to look at data blindly, but rather to really think about what's generating those data and then figure out the kind of theoretical structures that might be used to help us figure out what kinds of interventions, like lowering prices, might be effective. Okay, so that's kind of right now where this field is in terms of why economists and data scientists are talking to each other a lot. And at this point, what I'd like to do now is sort of give our panelists a chance to talk about their experiences integrating economics and data science. The first question that I want to, pardon me, there's a computer froze there. The first question that I want to pose to our panelists, and they're going to all go in alphabetical order, is can they briefly describe a project that utilized their combined skills as an economist and data analyst to solve a business problem? Okay. So Anthony, you go first.
Thank you, Dr. Samuel. Yeah, so this one I saw this in your email earlier, and I was thinking about an old analysis that I had done with a group of people at American Express business travel, which is a really interesting space, the travel space. And one of the things that we were looking at is how are we pushing revenue to our suppliers being airlines, hotels, car rental agencies, et cetera. And we were looking specifically for airlines at this point, and we're looking at average ticket prices. So Amex Business Travel is one of the largest business travel agencies in the world, or is the largest, doing roughly 36 to $40 billion a year of air sales alone. So they account for a significant portion of the market. And they have a lot of internal data. They have internal data on who books, when they book, and what they're booking, what the placement of search results are, which is a key one. And so the thing that we were looking at is going back to our big air suppliers and saying, based on where we push your search result when it comes through an online booking tool for a business traveler, we can drive more revenue. Typically, business travelers are booking, business class, first class, not very often booking economy class unless they're domestic. And we saw a couple things. So we knew the placement of search results based on the internal data. We knew the prices. We knew price fluctuation because we had access to that from an airline's central distribution system. And we were able to go back to them and say, okay, we understand that travelers book roughly 3 weeks in advance. They're not always booking the lowest logical airfare. So there's this new concept in the industry of lowest logical airfare. They're not always booking lowest logical airfare. And if we place them at the top of the search result, it's not necessarily that they're going to choose you, but actually we found about 3 or 4 search results down, it was the most common sort of selection. We never really got down, into the detail of like why that area of a search result was where people decided. But things that came up that I found really interesting and that I was digging deeper on is when travelers were booking, and then why they weren't booking their lowest logical airfare. And what you actually found out is you could see what departure airport they had. And so when you think about big metro areas like Baltimore, you have Baltimore International Airport, you have DC, you have Reagan and Dulles, you have the proximity to Philly. In New York, you have 3 major airports that go, out to international markets. What you find is that people will select the airport closest to their home. I mean, you would hypothesize that that was what they were doing, but that is why companies often spend more than they plan to in air transactions a year. And I found really interesting that, naturally people are ignoring their company's directive to select the lowest logical airfare to suit, the fact that they had to travel and pick an airport closest to home.
Great.
That was the project I'd use.
Thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, hi everyone. So in my most recent role at FTI Consulting, I was in the Health Economics and Policy group, and we had a lot of pharma clients, and specifically one client, and I managed quite a few of these projects, small teams of data analysts and budding economists out of undergrad, and one of our clients specifically was Genentech. They're a biopharma company out in San Francisco, and they were really interested in understanding, like, how does what's called utilization management in the pharma world, like how does that influence medication adherence and demand for drugs? And utilization management, the concept is essentially like when someone goes to a doctor's office and they are prescribed an expensive medication. That expensive medication sometimes needs to be pre-authorized by their insurance before they can prescribe it and before they can purchase it from the pharmacy, because the drug is so expensive, and essentially the pharma company or the insurance company that insures the patient needs to be sure, and they need like all of this additional data and paperwork from the physician that basically provides a business case that provides this case to the insurer that essentially convinces them that this patient needs the drug because they are very sick, and because they need the drug. And a lot of times these really expensive drugs are like, they're very few and far between, and they like target rare diseases and things that are pretty uncommon in the general population. Like for instance, there's this one drug that treats this rare type of cancer that's almost $2 million a shot. Like I wish I was kidding. And American healthcare is very messed up. But like you need prior authorization from insurers to actually like get these drugs, or else the insurer will not pay for them, and the patient could die in some cases. So Genentech was really interested in understanding, well, like, and this isn't really a very well studied like topic, like how utilization management like affects medication adherence and affects whether or not the patient ultimately like purchases the drug and actually uses the drug and actually comes back and refills that drug once they've run out of it. And what we were looking at was we were looking at a bunch of different domains that kind of describe different factors that leads to someone like taking a drug versus not. And like utilization management was one of those factors. And so we looked at a bunch of other factors like the route of administration that the drug has. Like, is it sublingual? Do you have to take it orally? Is it an injectable? Do you have to receive it in an outpatient clinic in a hospital? Things of that nature. Like, how does that affect demand? We looked at the cost, the overall cost of the drug, which affects pre-authorizations or prior authorizations, which also indirectly affects demand. We looked at various medication adherence factors that may affect demand, and we also looked at like different demographics of different patient types that may affect demand for certain types of very expensive drugs, if perchance these patients have a rare disease. And like so Genentech was really interested in understanding like, okay, like we have a lot of cancer drugs that are really expensive, and routinely like this company is routinely like arguing and like negotiating with insurers trying to accurately price their drugs, and a lot of their drugs need prior authorization from insurers to be prescribed. So they were really interested in understanding like how much this affects demand for their drugs. So we looked at a bunch of different diseases as well, diseases that Genentech normally treats. We also looked at a lot of we looked at a lot of different statistical models that might be able to like capture this issue accurately. And what we ended up doing was we kind of like pulled a lot of data from the literature on a lot of these different factors and kind of created like Likert scale scoring systems for each domain and for each drug and for each disease that those drugs treat. And then we kind of developed this Z-scoring system where we weighted the different factors based on expert interviews with physicians, based on how much they felt it was really necessary to really to factor in those domains into our analysis. What we ended up with was like this scoring system from 0 to 1. It was like this like index or composite index, which kind of like ranked these different factors, and you overall end up with what we called a burden score, which was like, it was like this crazy acronym. And it really like, it helped the pharma company really prioritize different factors that they were considering like during the pricing process. And it helped provide them a lot of additional context that they could then take back to the insurance companies in their negotiations to say like, okay, well, like if this drug treats X domains, and X diseases for X patient populations, like we can, these are the factors that we should really be considering here. So it was really interesting project. A lot of additional examples from where that came from, but that's just
Great.
one that I thought was cool.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was super cool. Use Z-scores. That's
Yeah.
right out of your undergrad stats there. Brian, next, you're up next.
That's great. Thank you, Professor Samuel, and thank you, Daniel. I think in my role, I'm very much focused on ROI and revenue or cost cutting at a lot of large corporations. So it's always great to be reminded that data science in terms of patient health outcomes is out there and proliferating. So that's great. Good. Yeah. Thanks. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm in corporate strategy at Teradata. And so Teradata is one of the largest data warehouses. Used to be on-prem, and now very focused on the cloud. And so in my day-to-day job, we're really thinking about, the problem to solve really is, hey, what are the data science and data science teams, whether they're, data engineers or the actual data science folks doing the work, or the heads of data science departments or CEOs, CFOs, what are they trying to accomplish with their business? And so really that's generating what are the questions that are being asked of the data science. And so, which of course generates in turn, which statistical analysis should we be using, which tools should we be using? So my team's very focused on the market for use cases and tools. And so from an economic standpoint, we actually always start very much at a micro level, right? So what is the individual consumer doing? And so you can pick an individual consumer like a Verizon customer who lives in Ohio. What are they doing on a day-to-day basis? And where are the data capture feeds into Verizon that they either get directly from Verizon or from third-party sources? And so you can imagine Verizon with 150 million customers, lots and lots of data sources, which means lots and lots of different ways to approach that data. And so the type of different tools and the compute power needed to do that, again, very much part and parcel of my job all day, every day. So what's out there? What are people using to do things like engineer data pipelines, data visualization, exploration, data cataloging on the data management side? What are the best ways and fastest ways to do the sort of model training or model fine tuning in the space? And then of course, the big one where our company really excels, small plug there, is on deployment, right? Because can you deploy at scale at 150 million customers when you're looking at propensity to churn, right? Because you lose at 150 million customers, you're losing thousands of customers a day potentially. Well, cut that by 10%. That's huge, right? The compounding of that is really important. And so that's why data scientists make so much money. And that's why data scientists tools like ours charge so much money, because the value is really there. I think one interesting use case for a client that we're excited to launch was the New York Giants. And so they've got lots of data from their season ticket holders, who's purchasing in the shop, who's visiting online, third-party sources. And so Professor Samuel had the example of the data on the waves, which is really interesting, and a couple points that illustrate, or a couple of data points that illustrate the broader point. But what do you do with this mass proliferation of data? And if you don't have the tools to explore it and search it and query it and do all of the work behind that to get to the model, and then you can't deploy the model, then what do you do with that? And so that was the issue that the New York Giants were having. They had installed new people and new tools to capture all this data. And so what, right? And so the segments were the same segments they had been 5 years earlier. So our team went in and showed the power of the re-engineering and architecting, really, and the feature engineering of the data to get to improve some of the models that they had already had to make them much, much better. And so you could see that in the scoring, and it was really interesting. So they were able to get to these hyper segmentation of diehard fans, luxury buyers, business users only, and like the list continues, to really market to those folks and actually do dynamic pricing in some of the outreach. And so at the end of the day, it was how can we get more money from our customers, but you're also targeting those folks that are interested and giving them the right message and not trying to sell them stuff that just goes to their spam folder. So a really involved way to try to get the best offers and the best experience out to their fan base. So I think a really interesting use case of going from, hey, we're capturing all this data, great start, and now we're using all of these tools in concert to really get to an outcome where fans are happier, and of course, your top and bottom line look better, and you're able to employ more data scientists than you were the other day.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Brian. That was a nice overview of all the different industries that you're working in. All right, we've got Norm Sedgley up next. Norm, I think you're muted.
Yes, I'm muted. Thanks, Andrew. I think I've had every one of the panelists in class at one point or another in the past. I've been at Loyola for 25 years, and it's fair to say that the focus of my professional career has been on teaching economics, particularly macroeconomics, and doing research in the area of macroeconomics and international trade. And that research has been both, what we call applied, which uses a lot of data and statistics, as well as theory. And those are two things in economics that we really can't separate. It is the theory that informs good empirical work and data analysis in our discipline. And so about 12 years ago, I was approached by a friend, an old friend, somebody I hadn't been in touch with for quite some time, who was the director of data analytics at Microsoft Corporation. He was working closely at the time with Susan Athey, actually. We saw her in Andrew's presentation. And he was living out in Seattle, and he was breaking away from Microsoft, and he was starting his own data science consulting company. And he asked me if I would like to be involved. And so since then, I have made a lot of connections in this field and done some extensive work for two different consulting firms. And these consulting firms hire me with both my theoretical background and my empirical background to help them solve problems in data science, mostly in the area of finance and banking. That's where I've done most of my work. I've also done some work in the real estate area, and I've done some data science work also in the area of health economics and biostatistics. I speak a little bit to that later also. So my experience is fairly eclectic, and the companies that I work with, it's a fairly eclectic list of companies also. So the biggest company that I've worked for is a company called Thrivent Financial out in Minneapolis. You may have heard of them. They're a Fortune 500 financial services company. And I've worked for startup companies out on the West Coast who want to figure out how they can make data science their quote unquote secret sauce that will give them some type of a competitive advantage that will allow them to tap into the deep pockets of some venture capitalist. So I have a lot of experience seeing the entire life cycle of a data science project. And my background in economics, I think, has been very useful throughout that entire life cycle. So Andrew had asked me to think of sort of one example where maybe I brought something really unique to the table to solve a problem for one of our clients. So one of the projects that I worked on was for a credit union on the West Coast. It was the Washington State Employees Credit Union. And they had a small dollar lending program that they were using in order to keep their clients away from sort of more predatory payday lenders. So the idea was to have people fill out loan applications for a modest amount of money, approve those applications very, very quickly, and then have the loan money repaid over a fairly short period of time. And so it was a service that the bank thought was very important to provide to their customers. What they were doing was basically purchasing a commercial credit score, and they had a cutoff that would determine whether or not, it was very arbitrary the way they set the cutoff. It's very arbitrary, and that would determine whether or not they were approved for the loan application. And they thought we should be able to do better than this. We have a lot of proprietary data on our customers and our members. We should be able to leverage that data to provide higher quality lending to our members and make this loan portfolio more profitable. It was one of the least successful loan portfolios that they had at the credit union. So they took a first pass at estimating a model from their own data, and it actually performed worse than the credit score. So they asked me if I would take a look at the problem, and to go back to some of Andrew's original point, I noticed immediately that they had a problem in understanding the data generating process. So what they were doing was they were looking at a group of individuals and vetting them and determining whether or not to give them a loan. Then they were giving them a loan and observing whether or not they defaulted on the loan. And they were building their data set from individuals who had been approved, right? And then they're giving a loan, and all the people that were in the data set had already gone through this vetting process. So it's not a randomly selected sample, right? And so that's a violation of one of the key assumptions that is necessary to apply these simple type of statistical models that they were trying to apply to their own data. The solution to that is basically a two-step estimation method. So you estimate a model in the first step, and it allows you to construct a variable that you include in the second step, which corrects for the bias in the prediction of how likely an individual is to repay their loan. And that was something that none of the computer scientists or people with more of a straightforward, statistical background saw in the data when they were using it. And so we made that correction and then went to sort of an ROC, a receiver operator curve type of analysis to determine what the optimal cutoff is in order to approve or not approve a loan. And within about 6 months, we turned that lending program around from one that was really not very profitable to one of the most profitable lending programs within the credit union. So that's just sort of one example of how understanding the data generating process, what is it that econometrics offers that other branches of data analytics don't really offer? It really is understanding how to deal with messy data that's not generated in a neat laboratory experiment, but data that's generated out there in the real world, right? That can be really messy and difficult to deal with. That's what we have an eye on as economists.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Norm. The next question is going to be directed primarily to Anthony and Brian. It's already up on the screen. Are there any particular data sources or indicators that leaders should be asking to make sure they're considering how the broader economy is impacting their business? And this, you can speak from your own experience. Do you follow things like, I don't know, the Chinese economic data or property markets? What sorts of indicators do you follow? Brian, you can go first.
Yeah, I'm glad to start. So I think fortunately for me in my day job, there's more than a few different third-party consulting firms that are very actively engaged in market sizing. And so they may be able to they do say through lots of different data sources that the market for vector database capabilities, something integral to sort of deep learning and Gen AI, is growing at X% a year up to say $5 million in 2025. And so when you aggregate all of the different capabilities, especially in a world where they're incredibly dynamic, something like synthetic data, which is really cool and interesting and hasn't been around meaningfully for very long, will grow into something bigger. And so being able to capture the data points on each of the individual capabilities and then in mass and aggregate that across similar use cases, like we had a few examples here, like credit scores to improve the performance of loan portfolios, for example, right? So when you can see what's being used by that and aggregated across, we can get a sense for, hey, what capabilities should we be building towards? And in order to do that, in sort of what's coming down the pike, you really get behind this innovation roadmap. And so we're doing both things, right? We're trying to skate to where the puck is in terms of growth and market size, which means use cases and applications across all of these industry verticals, but also trying to be, thought leaders in the industry and push interesting use cases because we've got a lot of very talented people working with lots of other very talented people in the industry to do really new, interesting, cutting edge things with, of course, the application across businesses. So fortunately for that is really a great piece. And then I'll add to that the quantitative aspect of just talking to folks in data science teams in different roles around the world, really about what their problems are in their day-to-day in terms of the tools they're using and the methods, but also what kind of business problems are they trying to solve and trying to get ahead of that.
Great, thanks. Brian, before I move on to Anthony, could you give us a 30-second explanation of what synthetic data is, since I'm not sure everybody knows what that is?
Yes, you'll all know it all too well in a year or two. So we'll just go back to the Verizon example. They're generating, lots and lots of data every minute, every second, and they're capturing all of that data. But some of that, or data, actually, Verizon may be a bad idea. We'll use Cigna as a health insurer, right? Capturing lots and lots of data. A lot of that's private data, and it can't be shared. Internally at Cigna, there are people who don't have access to Brian Nelson's health claims, for example. And so how do you do statistical modeling and do all of the deployment across lots of different functions when they can't see the data about Brian? And so the answer is synthetic data. Another really great use case is the Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, et cetera. There's lots of reasons you can't share that data. So you take the raw data set and you model out the raw data set and create a new data set that has all the same features and characteristics of the core data set, but without the personal information. So it's not just pulling my social security or number or name, because you could still identify me. It's really masking it algorithmically to have that data. And now you can build and train the model without violating any privacy laws in any country, and then deploy the model against the real data. And then so suddenly it's working and operationalizing and it's in production, but it's not based on that PII or that top secret information. And we see the defense sector, health insurance sector, and more the financial services sector coming into play in the market.
Great, thank you very much. Anthony, I'll turn it over to you. What indicators do you follow?
Yeah, so not necessarily a lot of macroeconomic indicators, but what we use, especially in corporate transformation at JP Morgan, is a lot of benchmarking data. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is looking at the servicing cost for paying employees globally. So when you think about the size and scale of our firm, 310,000 employees, 65 different countries with employees, some of it requires in-country data processing. That means I have to go through essentially 65 different benchmarking studies to understand how we're performing against some local in-country companies, and then as a Fortune 100, large company, how are we doing overall? So we use a lot of benchmarking data from that standpoint.
Great, thank you very much. We're now going to shift our focus of this conversation a little bit towards talking about some of the tools and the techniques that people use in this industry. And I'm going to now pose this to all the panelists. I'd like them in about 2 minutes to talk about what software, what statistical, mostly what software they use in their daily work, so that people can get a flavor for when you sit down on your at your laptop. What do you open up and what do you look at? So again, we'll go in the same order: Anthony, Daniel, Brian, and Norm. Anthony.
Sure. The biggest software for us is Alteryx. So Alteryx is a fantastic workflow tool that is able to aggregate data from multiple sources. You can think internal, external. So I'm talking about this benchmarking data, this large amount of internal data. I can use that to sort of combine it, perform some, do some logic on it, data validation, data cleansing, all in one software, and push it out for visualization. We don't, in financial services, we don't, or at least at JP Morgan, we don't necessarily use Python. It's not really sort of an approved method. But we do use software like Alteryx, Tableau to do that.
Excellent, thank you. Daniel. Daniel, I think you're muted.
Oops, sorry about that. I've definitely used Alteryx Designer, expensive license, but I've definitely used it to streamline process flows for a lot of my projects in the past, especially at Deloitte. I've used Power BI and Tableau a lot to do heat mapping when we were focusing on like health equity issues for the government and CMS, so the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And I've primarily used SAS, data, and R to analyze a lot of claims data, like specifically Medicare and Medicaid data. Very, very efficient at processing huge amounts of data. SAS and Stata specifically are really useful because those are the primary platforms that the government uses to house millions and millions of rows of claims data over many years. And some people might consider SAS to be archaic, but I actually think it's really useful and still very much a prominent statistical software in use these days.
Great, thank you, Daniel. For those listening in, I should note that if you take Gary Tan's econometrics class, you will learn to use data in there. So something to put on your resume. Great, Brian.
Yeah, I think for me, some of the core centerpiece tools in the data science industry, Teradata, of course, Snowflake, Databricks, and then the cloud service providers, Google, Microsoft, and AWS. And so I think about those 6 core tools, and there's a few other there, but SAS I'd kind of put there in some instances, but really have the potential to be the end-to-end platform. And so you can do all the data management, data prep, and prep there. You can do a lot of the modeling, and then you can actually deploy it in production. And so there's lots of trade-offs in terms of price performance, ease of use, integration across other third parties like an Alteryx or a DBT Labs or Matillion, some of the other names in the space on the data side. But really those software pieces, and really at its heart, it's about the power of the compute engine. So how fast can you do it and what's it going to cost you? So that sort of price performance is always at the top of the list. And those are the 6 that will compete across different use cases in terms of price performance, and lots of other stuff that's important, but price performance.
Great. Norm. You're muted still, thanks.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So my experience is a little bit different because a lot of the data science projects that I'm working on, like I said, might be for startup companies, or it might be for something like this credit union that didn't have a data science program, but they thought that data science would be useful to them. So a lot of these projects are not necessarily well-established companies that are well-established within data science that have millions of dollars, for example, to invest in software and to pay for very expensive software licenses. And so we usually step in with Python and R because they're free and because they're very effective. And so, what I found, at least for myself, is that Python is really pretty good at manipulating data and cleaning data. And that's typically what I use to clean data and to get a data set ready for analysis. If you want to do heavy duty statistics, the stuff that's more geared towards the type of things we would learn in an econometrics class, R tends to be the tool that's favored. And so I know Python and I know R very, very well. In fact, I'll be developing a course here at Loyola and doing econometrics using the R programming language. Now, the fact that they're free makes them a little bit like the Wild West, right? You can go down and download a package to do almost anything. And if you don't know really the mechanics behind how that package was developed, it might not be doing things correctly. You have to kind of keep that in mind when you use something like Python and R. And so I mentioned before that I had done some work in the medical field and in biostatistics. And the work that I've done has been for a company called Allscripts. And Daniel, I don't know if you've ever heard of Allscripts or not, but I've done some work for them. Yeah. And so when I do work for them, I use Stata mostly. And the data engineers that I work with use SAS. So like you said, it's still out there and it's still a very important piece of software. And my understanding from what they have told me is that the reason they use Stata and SAS is because they're not free. And so those are companies that sort of stand behind their software, right? There's a liability issue and there's an extra layer of legal protection if they're using something like Stata or SAS, and there's an error somewhere in the actual program, they have the liability insurance to cover whatever damages might be created by estimating a model that's being used in biostatistics or medicine where people's lives are potentially at stake, right? So I've used Stata and SAS a lot in those areas. In my own personal research as an economist, I mean, the stuff that, I've published like 30 articles in peer-reviewed, journals. And when I do that stuff, I've really, over time, and I think somewhat because of data science, have really gravitated towards R. And probably a mix between R and Stata, sort of 50-50 are my two preferred programs for doing more academic style research. But yeah, R, Python, Stata, and SAS are the 4 programs that I've used most extensively.
Great, thank you all. The next question I'm going to have, let's see, Daniel and Brian talk a little bit about. What controls do you envision there need to be or that you've seen in place to prevent sort of overconfidence in data analysis models? I'm sort of paraphrasing one of the questions that were given to us. But essentially, do people become overconfident in data analysis, and what kinds of checks and balances do you think the industry should have or does already have in this field?
Yeah, I'm glad to start. Yeah, I think once the score on the model comes out great, I think there's lots of confidence then. But fortunately, there's a lot of different sort of what we'll call ML ops or ML ops systematic processes to watch that in terms of auditing and governance. So they exist. Are you using them? The type of explainability and observation on the model outcome in terms of deployment, what's actually happening. And I think one that we're seeing more and more be more important and top of mind for data science teams is bias detection, right? And so what kind of bias is coming out of the model, and are you able to observe that on the back end, right? Because you can't always observe that once the model is being built. It's not until production or pre-production that you're able to see that. And it's not till production at scale, right? Millions of customers that starts to generate. And so how are you monitoring that? And do you have the processes in place in terms of people and systems to mitigate it? And so I think you've got to be aware of all those things, that the tools exist and know how to use them. But once you put them into effect, I think the guardrails are pretty good in my opinion.
Great, thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I would add 2 points to this. Like, one would be like providing reasonable margins of error on all of your like outcome data points. I think that's been really helpful for clients to see, like, especially when I'm like presenting an analysis. And it gives them confidence, like, to know that, we're not infallible and our models that we're producing are not infallible. And there's definitely some like error within our models. And then the other thing on top of that would be like stating your assumptions very clearly, because I've been in client calls where like one client will like, or one person on the client team will like point out like an assumption or question an assumption that we had, and it like blows up the entire model, and we have to like go back to the drawing board. And it like changes a lot of things. And then like on top of that is like having very like robust reasonableness checks. So that's like really important in healthcare. Like we're constantly validating like the messy data sets that we get from enterprise data warehouses that house Medicare and Medicaid claims. You're working with millions and millions of rows and observations of data points with like 45 variables. So, you know, having those robust reasonableness checks like add confidence to whatever model you're building.
Great, thank you, Daniel. All right, the next question kind of related to this point, and I'm going to have Anthony and Norm speak to this. Do you see any dangers or have any concerns with the current trends in analytics, things like machine learning, large language models, ChatGPT, the stuff that we're hearing about a lot of? Anthony.
Sorry, struggling to get off mute there. So, of course, I mean, there's a danger in sort of any new technology, I would say. But I think, you know, one of the things that we're doing at JP Morgan, and you can hear our head of AI research who came from Carnegie Mellon talk about this, is, you know, her view is that machine learning is sort of the future, or the road to the future. And artificial intelligence is this overblown sort of bullshit. And you think about the capabilities of machine learning and how we deploy them in large firms like ours. We're using them to perform, you know, general ledger reconciliations. We're using them to create internal policy based on data that we have for policy we've had in the past, whether it's employee policy, client policy, et cetera. We're using machine learning, large language models to help employees with their a day in the life of an employee, right? So help me manage my calendar, help me, you can train this stuff to sort of deploy and do that for an individual. So I certainly think there's dangers if it goes unchecked and you don't have a strong control organization and a strong control governance model in place to prevent abuse. But we're using it in a way, at least at JP Morgan, on the corporate side of the house, in a way to make life easier.
Great, thank you, Anthony. Norm, any comments or thoughts on that?
Maybe a few. You know, recently I've been working my way through this rather thick book. I don't know if you can see the title of it, but it's called The Economics of Artificial Intelligence. And it's basically a group of articles from the second NBER conference on artificial intelligence and economics. A lot of these questions are raised in this book, and it seems like the economists who are out there, Susan Athey, for example, and Varian and others have published articles in this volume. There are those who are technological, optimists who see absolutely no dangers whatsoever in these trends in machine learning and these other new technologies that seem to be evolving very rapidly. And then other economists are very concerned about the impact on the overall economy and the job market, et cetera. One question I have is whether or not in the future these types of technologies are going to actually change the way we as economists do research. Are they going to help us formulate better research questions? What role will machine learning have in the way that we analyze our data, right, within the economics profession? And I think it's important to keep an open mind about that. And I think it's important to keep an eye on the difference between what it is that a machine learning model is trying to do and what it is that we want to do as economists, right? So when you really back up to first principles in economics is a discipline that relies very much on deductive reasoning, right? I mean, it really is about constructing an idea about the way the economy works, and the primary role, not the only role, but the primary role of data analysis and economics as a discipline is to test hypotheses and do inference, right? And then this will be something that, like Daniel, you're familiar with if you're doing work within healthcare. You're not really that interested in classifying things and predicting things all the time as much as you are knowing what's the causal effect. If somebody takes this drug, is it going to improve their condition? What if I interact it with this other drug? Right? Is that going to create some type of a, a problem for this patient? Those types of questions are always going to be questions of inference, right? And so I think there's always going to be a role there for econometrics who understand that data generating process and can sort of filter through the biases that I think are really inherent in some of these machine learning methods. But they're not concerned with bias. They're concerned with prediction and classification. And that's something that's quite a bit different from the role of statistics and a lot of economics, which is understanding the data generating process and doing valid hypothesis testing and establishing valid tests of causation, as you mentioned, Andrew, in your introduction. And so I think it's important to keep an open mind about machine learning and the possibilities and the opportunities that it could present to our discipline. But and so I know, as an economist, as I'm sure you know, Andrew, as a PhD economist, right, that there is a bit of a set against anything that can be considered data mining in our discipline. As soon as an economist hears that word, those two words together, data mining, they go like this. It's just like, right? But I do think it's important to keep an open mind, I think, about the potential benefits of these new technologies for the way that we do our work as economists. And it's also new. It's like, gross Knightian uncertainty. Like, the way we typically think about uncertainty is that we can imagine all the different possible things that can result from a new technology. And then we might subjectively attach probabilities to each one of those states of the world. But what I'm saying is that this stuff is so new and it's so unpredictable that we can't even articulate what all those different possible states of the world are, let alone attach subjective probabilities to them. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I'm kind of too ignorant to give you a better answer than that. And probably we all are.
Yeah. Let's see. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add to those comments on the same question?
Yeah, just thank you, Professor. Just to be brief, I think in terms of dangers, there's both the micro and the macro. I think just using, again, Professor Sedgley's example from Thrivent, right? When you're really building this model, we're talking about cutoffs for a mortgage, and that's a family who doesn't move into the house that they love because of the cutoff score, if it's on the bad side, or it's the family that gets the house that they would have been denied for because the loan officer was looking at 5 variables and not Professor Sedgley's variable that had great. So I think there's both positives and negative there. And then I think on the macro side, more than anything else in my mind, given all the buzz, is just the pace, right? Our company had theories about Gen AI and deep learning 6 months ago that aren't even true anymore. They've changed so dramatically. And so how can we, right, and thinking very macro as a culture, adapt to rapid changes like that when, like, as a government, and right, we can't even really get social media right, and that's been around since 2005. So it's tricky, right? It's definitely going to be tricky on both the micro and macro level, but we're up for the challenge.
Great, thank you. The next question is going to be actually for you, Brian, and Anthony, after you. As upper management, to what extent do you think it is necessary for you as managers to understand the intricate details of sort of the statistical models? Is a high-level understanding sufficient, or a need for sort of deeper technical knowledge? And I want to kind of frame that question really quickly with the 2008 financial crisis in the background, where you had a lot of financial firms who hired these so-called quants with backgrounds in physics. And the people making the investment decisions didn't often understand these crazy, complicated models that the quants created and just applied them to investment strategies. And the lesson we got from that was never use something that you don't fully understand. And when you look at these kinds of new models in machine learning, no one really understands all the details of these models. So that's kind of where this question is coming from. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, glad to start. Definitely, you put a different spin on that question by referencing 2008. So my answer won't change, but I'm second guessing it. Yeah, I think in terms of upper management, I think there's sort of and I hate this term, but enough to be dangerous. And so you've got to be familiar with that for credibility with your team, right? But really, I think that in terms of an upper management, and whether that's the chief data science officer, it's really how they're interacting with the business unit heads, right? Because if they can't explain the value of the output of the model and deployment and churn, if they can't say, hey, we're going to cut our churn by 10% a month, well, and it means X millions of dollars. If they can't have those conversations, then the data science isn't interesting, right? And so it's only like, it really is a world of what have you done for me lately, and what are you going to do for me tomorrow? And so it's really incumbent on upper management to understand the financial ramifications of the business. And that's where you're really thinking about keeping the costs of the team and the tools down, or the data storage and compute costs. All of that needs to be balanced across the financial interests of the business, or else it all goes away. And so being able to have those conversations with the marketing department, the finance department, the C-suite are, I think, a lot more critical, and being that advocate for these really great outcomes than the statistical methods. At some point, the coin kind of flips.
Great, thank you. Anthony, real quick, do you have a comment on that too?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that enough to be dangerous is exactly.
I like that. That's a great takeaway. Enough to be dangerous. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left, and I'd like each of the panelists to talk briefly about what habits can students develop to become lifelong learners. You all talked about how rapidly things are changing. So what's your sort of 1 minute spiel of advice to each of the students? We'll go in the same order: Anthony, Daniel, Nelson, Brian and Sedgley. Okay, so 1 minute each.
I won't need a whole minute. My only thing will be curious. I find myself super curious about like what data tells you, the tools that people use, how what they can do. Be curious. I myself, I'm trying to teach myself Python for the last, Norm, you'll appreciate this. I'm trying to teach myself Python for the last about year and a half. It's going sort of well. But be curious about other things and like expand your mind and give your mind exercise like a muscle, right? I'm trying to learn different languages. I know about 5 now. And that is really interesting to me. I want to learn the piano because I don't know how to play an instrument. Like sort of exercising your mind is just really important.
Great. Daniel.
Yeah, totally agree. My other suggestion would be to go on Coursera and find as many free courses as you can on data science and data engineering. Those capabilities are not going away, and you will always be employed. I have recruiters reaching out to me all the time, even when I'm in school, like not employed. Like they are still reaching out to me, trying to recruit me to like smaller consulting firms that are looking for data science managers. And
Great, thank you. Brian, sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there just to give Brian and Norm a quick chance here.
Yeah, so I definitely underscore Anthony's comment about to stay curious. I think there's a really healthy dose of FOMO in the industry, which is a good thing. And so you really want to be up to date on what cool things are happening, because you'll get more credibility with your peers.
Great, thank you. Norm.
Yeah, so the challenge of going last is that people have, just can reiterate what some other people have said, right? So I would reiterate the idea of going on to Coursera and just picking up courses and really just getting your hands dirty. You cannot learn how to do data analytics and data science just by reading a book. You won't get it. What you need to do is go out and get some data, right? Take a course from Coursera. I learned both R and Python from courses that I took for free on Coursera. I think you could pay $50 and get a certificate, which I don't need. But you can get on there, you can learn a lot from those courses, and you really don't have to pay anything to take those courses. Then you can go out into something like Kaggle, Kaggle, LE. It's a website that has data science competitions. You could download data sets and get into competition with other data science teams and see how well you and your team of data scientists can do at solving really complicated problems. Some of those problems may be forecasting sales for a company, or I remember one of the competitions they had was trying to figure out and predict who would survive the Titanic disaster, right?
Thank you, Norm.
Based on the
Sorry, Norm, we're out of time here.
Okay.
And Anthony tells me data camp is good. We're out of time. We wanted to end right at 6 o'clock. Thank you all to the panelists for taking their time to come and speak with us. And we appreciate you joining us on this event.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, have a
Thanks
good
a
night,
lot,
everyone. Thank
Andrew,
you.
and all the panelists.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.